AITA for leaving my husband after finding out he secretly funded his ex's house. My name's Lauren, I'm 41, I work as an architect at a mid-size firm downtown, and I've been married to my husband Chris for 4 years, married 4, together 5.5, a blended household with his 2 kids from his first marriage and our 1 daughter together, who just turned 2. I found out 3 months ago that for 6 years, going back further than Chris and I had even met, he'd been quietly funding his ex-wife's entire mortgage out of an account I didn't know existed. I want to tell you how I found it, what he told me when I confronted him, and why the mortgage itself, as strange as this sounds, ended up being the least upsetting part of what I eventually learned. Chris and Jenna were married for 7 years and have 2 kids together, Mia, who's 11 now, and Ben, who's 9. Their divorce happened about a year before Chris and I met, and from everything I understood at the time, from Chris, from mutual friends who knew both of them, from the general shape of how he talked about it, it had been a reasonably amicable split. Not painless, nobody's is, but not the kind of scorched earth divorce some people go through. They shared custody roughly 50-50. Chris paid standard child support, an amount that had actually been set through their divorce agreement and adjusted once through the family court a couple of years later when his income changed. He spoke about Jenna, in the years I knew them as co-parents, the way you'd hope a divorced parent would speak about their ex, respectfully, without bitterness, focused on the kids rather than on old grievances. I want to be honest that I liked that about him, early on. I dated men before Chris who couldn't mention an ex without their whole face changing, and Chris's steadiness about Jenna felt like evidence of emotional maturity, not a red flag. When we got engaged, 3 years into dating, he introduced me properly to Jenna at one of Ben's soccer games, and she was warm and normal about it in a way that made the whole blended family transition feel, if not easy exactly, at least manageable. I remember thinking, watching the 2 of them coordinate snack duty for the team without a hint of tension, that I'd lucked into a genuinely functional co-parenting situation, the kind you hear horror stories about not having. There's a specific memory from early in our engagement that I've been turning over a lot since all this came out. Jenna hosted Mia's 10th birthday party at her house, and Chris and I went together. And at some point in the afternoon I found myself in Jenna's kitchen helping her plate cupcakes while Chris took the kids out back for a piñata. She thanked me, unprompted, for being so good with the kids, and honestly, for being good for Chris too. He seems lighter than he did right after the divorce. I remember feeling flattered by that, feeling like I'd been given some kind of blessing by the person best positioned to compare who Chris was before me and after. I didn't know, standing in that kitchen, that the reason Chris seemed lighter might have had less to do with me and more to do with a financial arrangement that had already been running for over a year by that point, quietly solving one of the biggest sources of stress in Jenna's post-divorce life without either of us being any the wiser about what was actually holding that lightness up. We merged most of our finances when we got married, not entirely. We each kept a small personal account for things like gifts and hobbies, but our income, our mortgage, our daughter's expenses, all of it ran through joint accounts we built and managed together. Chris handled the bill pay side of things, similar to how a lot of couples split that kind of labor, and I handled our retirement contributions and investment tracking, since that's closer to what I'm naturally organized about. It felt, for 4 years, like a genuinely equal partnership, financially and otherwise. I used to tell my sister, only half joking, that Chris was annoyingly transparent about money, the kind of guy who'd show me a spreadsheet unprompted if a bill came in higher than expected. I think about that phrase a lot now. The account I found wasn't something I stumbled onto through suspicion. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters for understanding how long this had been going on without me having any reason to look. I found it because of a mortgage refinance mailer, one of those generic offers that get sent to homeowners periodically, addressed to Chris, from a bank I didn't recognize as one of ours. I almost tossed it straight into the recycling, the way you do with most of that junk mail, but something about the account number partially visible through the little plastic window on the envelope made me pause, because it didn't match either of the account numbers I knew for our mortgage or our joint checking. I asked Chris about it that evening, genuinely expecting some boring explanation, an old account from before we merged finances that he'd forgotten to close, a mailer sent in error, something like that. He got a strange look on his face, just for a second, before he said, "Oh, that's probably just a leftover thing, I'll deal with it," in a tone that was almost convincingly casual, except that I've been married to this man for 4 years and I know what his actual casual sounds like. and that wasn't it. I let it go that night. I didn't let it go for long. About a week later, while helping him sort through a stack of mail he'd let pile up on his desk, the way it does for both of us during busy stretches, I found a statement from that same bank, this time fully visible, not hidden behind an envelope window. It was a checking account, in Chris's name only, that I had genuinely never known existed. The statement showed a recurring monthly transfer out, exactly $2,140, to what was labeled as an external mortgage servicer payment, going out like clockwork on the 3rd of every month. I did some quick mental math and my stomach dropped before I even confirmed anything, because $2,140 was a number I recognized, not from our own finances, but from an offhand comment Jenna had made once, years earlier, at one of the kids' birthday parties, about how much her mortgage payment had gone up after a rate adjustment. I hadn't thought about that comment in years. It came back to me standing in our kitchen with that statement in my hand like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. I want to describe what the next several days looked like, because I didn't confront Chris immediately, and I think that restraint mattered for how the rest of this played out. Part of it was strategic, the same instinct that made me pause before I said anything the first week. I've learned enough from other people's stories, and honestly from my own professional habit of not presenting a client with a half-formed theory before I've actually checked the load calculations, to know that confronting someone with a half-built case just gives them room to manage your reaction instead of answering the actual question. But part of it, if I'm honest, was fear. I wasn't ready yet to hear whatever explanation was coming, and some small part of me was still hoping, every day I didn't ask, that I'd find some boring, innocent reason for all of it before I had to. I did what I do professionally when I need to understand a structure before I trust it. I gathered information quietly and methodically before I said anything. I found the bank's online portal, and because Chris and I share a household laptop that still had some old saved logins from years back, including, it turned out, an autofill fragment for this account's username, I was able to piece together enough to request the account's full transaction history by mail, using my status as his spouse to make the request through the bank's standard channel, which took about 10 days to arrive. Those 10 days were some of the strangest of my marriage, going through completely ordinary routines, packing lunches, going to work, watching a movie with Chris on the couch on a Friday night with his arm around me, all while a request sat somewhere in a bank's processing queue that I knew was going to change everything, and he had no idea I'd made it. When it arrived, I sat at our kitchen table on a Saturday morning while Chris took the kids to Ben's soccer game, and read 6 years of transaction history for an account I hadn't known existed 3 weeks earlier. I remember the specific, mundane details of that morning oddly vividly, the coffee going cold next to the printed pages, the sound of our neighbor mowing his lawn outside, my daughter's monitor propped on the table in case she woke from her nap early, all of it happening around me while I methodically worked through 6 years of a life I hadn't known was running parallel to my own. The account had been opened almost 7 years ago, about a year and a half after Chris and Jenna's divorce, and, I did the math twice to be sure, roughly 8 months before Chris and I had our first date. The transfers to Jenna's mortgage servicer started almost immediately after the account opened and continued, without a single gap, every single month since, through the entirety of our dating relationship, our engagement, our wedding, and 4 years of our marriage. I made a spreadsheet, because apparently that's what I do under emotional duress, the same instinct that makes me annoyingly precise about load calculations at work taking over completely once I had 6 years of dates and dollar amounts in front of me. 6 years of $2,140 monthly payments, funded, I confirmed by cross-referencing against Chris's individual pay records I had access to through our joint tax filings, entirely out of his own income, meaning it hadn't technically touched our joint accounts directly, but it had absolutely touched what our joint accounts could have looked like, because that money, over 6 years, added up to just over $150,000 that could have gone toward our own mortgage principal, our daughter's college fund, our retirement, instead of quietly propping up a house Chris didn't live in, for a woman he'd been divorced from for going on 8 years. I sat there doing that math, watching the total climb into 6 figures on my little spreadsheet, and felt something I can only describe as grief for a version of our financial life that I believed in completely and that had apparently never fully existed the way I thought it did. I confronted him that night, after the kids were in bed. I didn't do it calmly, I'll admit that up front. I'd had the entire day to sit with what I'd read, and by the time he walked through our bedroom door I was sitting on the edge of the bed with the printed transaction history in my lap, and I just said, "I know about the account." He didn't try to deny it, which I'll credit him for, though it also meant the conversation moved very quickly into territory I wasn't emotionally braced for. "I can explain," he said. "It's not what it probably looks like." "Explain it, then," I said. "Because right now what it looks like is that you've been paying your ex-wife's entire mortgage in secret for 6 years, including every year we've been married, and I've never heard a single word about it." He sat down heavily on the end of the bed, put his head in his hands the way I imagine most people do in these moments, and told me his version. "After the divorce," he said, "Jenna had struggled more than either of them expected, a rough stretch professionally, a period where she genuinely might have had to sell the house and move the kids to a different school district, and Chris, watching Mia and Ben's stability hang in the balance, made a decision he described as, not really a decision, more like something I couldn't not do. He started quietly covering the mortgage, on top of his court-ordered child support, to make sure the kids didn't have to lose their home and their school and their friends on top of already losing the two-household version of their family." "Why hide it from me, though?" I said. "Even if I understood the impulse when it started, why keep hiding it once we were serious? Once we were engaged? Once we were married and merging our finances and I was sitting across from you doing our joint taxes? Because by the time we got serious, it already felt like this whole complicated thing I didn't know how to bring up without it sounding worse than it was," he said. "I kept telling myself I'd find the right moment. And then the right moment kept not existing, because there was no version of that conversation that didn't sound bad, and every month that passed made the next month's version of that conversation sound worse. I know that's not a real excuse. I know how that sounds. It sounds like 6 years of deciding, over and over, that I didn't get to know something that materially affects our entire financial life," I said. "That's not a moment you missed, Chris. That's hundreds of individual choices." He didn't argue with that. He just sat there, and I remember the silence in that room being one of the loudest things I've ever sat inside. I want to be honest that there was a version of me, sitting on that bed, that almost found this explanation acceptable. I have 2 stepkids I love. I understand, in the abstract, the impulse to protect children from the collateral damage of a divorce, even at real personal cost. For about 2 days after that conversation, I genuinely tried to hold the version of events Chris had given me, a well-intentioned, poorly communicated act of parental sacrifice, not a betrayal of our marriage. I even told my sister, on the phone, I think I actually understand why he did it, even if I hate how he handled telling me, and she asked me, gently, the same kind of question my sister always seems to ask at exactly the right moment: does understanding why change what you need to happen next? I didn't have a good answer for her yet. During those 2 days, Chris was different around the house, quieter, more careful, doing small unprompted things like taking the kids to school without being asked so I could sleep in, texting me during the day just to check how I was doing, the kind of attentiveness that felt, in the moment, like genuine remorse. I wanted to believe it was. Some part of me still does believe some of it was. Then I asked a question I should have asked immediately, and didn't, because I was still too rattled that first night to think clearly. Did Jenna know he was covering the whole mortgage, or did she think this was still just standard child support? Chris's hesitation before answering told me most of what I needed to know before he even said the words. "She knows I help," he said. "I don't think she's ever done the exact math on how much." That answer bothered me more than almost anything else in the entire conversation, because it meant this wasn't purely the story of a father protecting his kid's stability with Jenna's full knowledge and gratitude. It meant Chris had been managing what Jenna understood about her own financial situation for 6 years, letting her believe her own income and the standard child support were covering more of her mortgage than they actually were, which is its own strange kind of control dressed up as generosity. I called Jenna myself, 2 days later, without telling Chris I was going to do it. I want to explain why, because I know it might sound like an aggressive move, going around my husband to talk directly to his ex-wife about their private financial arrangement, but I'd reached a point where I needed information from a source that wasn't filtered through 6 years of Chris managing 2 separate versions of the truth. She picked up on the second ring, sounding a little wary. We weren't close enough that I called her out of the blue often, so I think she knew immediately something was wrong. I told her, as plainly and gently as I could manage, what I'd found, and asked her, directly, how much she'd understood about what Chris had actually been covering. There was a long pause. "I knew he helped some months when things were tight," she finally said. I did not know it was the whole payment, every single month, for 6 years. I thought, Lauren, I thought I was making that mortgage work on my own, mostly. I've been proud of that. I've told people that. I told my own mother that, at Thanksgiving, like 18 months ago, that I'd finally gotten myself financially stable after the divorce. I was proud of a thing that apparently wasn't actually true. He never told you it was the full amount, I said. It wasn't really a question. No, she said, and I could hear something shift in her voice, something between embarrassment and a kind of retroactive anger of her own. He'd send it and just say, "Don't worry about this month, I've got it," every month, like it was occasional generosity instead of the entire payment. I actually have a partner now, has Chris mentioned that? Mark and I have been together almost 2 years. Mark thinks I've been managing my own house all this time. This is going to be its own complicated conversation on my end too, apparently. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it, even though some small, ungenerous part of me also felt a strange kind of relief hearing that she was blindsided too, that this wasn't some quiet arrangement the two of them had built together with me as the only person left out of it. Don't apologize to me, she said. You didn't do this. I keep trying to figure out how I feel about it and I genuinely don't know yet. Grateful, I guess, that the kids never had to move. Furious that I didn't get to actually know that I've spent years thinking I did something on my own that I didn't fully do on my own. Both those things at once. It's a weird combination to sit with. That call recontextualized the whole situation for me in a way the bank statement alone hadn't. This wasn't a clean story of Chris quietly sacrificing for his kids with everyone's full understanding and consent. It was a story of Chris managing what two different women in his life understood about money and effort and sacrifice, letting Jenna believe she was independently capable of something she wasn't actually doing alone, and letting me believe, for 4 years, that our finances were fully merged and honest, while $150,000 of his income moved quietly around both of us. I went back to Chris with what I'd learned from that call, and that's when the second confrontation happened, the real one, the one that actually ended up mattering more than the first, because the first had still been operating on his terms, his framing, his explanation. This one wasn't. You let her think she was doing this on her own, I said. For 6 years. Why does that matter to you? What does she get out of believing that you needed her to believe? He didn't have a fast answer for that one, and the silence stretched long enough that I started filling it myself with worse and worse possibilities. I don't know, he finally said. I think some part of me needed her to still need me. Not romantically. I want to be really clear that's not what this was. But we built that whole life together, and then it just ended, legally, on paper, and I think I couldn't handle the idea of being completely unnecessary to it anymore. Paying that mortgage quietly was the only way I still felt like I mattered to the family I used to have, without it being a whole thing, without anyone having to talk about what that meant. That's the part one need you to actually sit with, I said. Not the money. The money I could maybe have worked through, even the secrecy, if it stopped there. But you just told me you needed your ex-wife to need you. I'm your current wife, Chris. I need to hear that you need me, not that some part of you is still organizing your life around still matching to someone else's. You do, he said. That's not, Lauren, that's not in competition with how I feel about you. It's felt like it might be, for 6 years, without me knowing it was happening, I said. That's the part that scares me. I asked him, directly, whether there had been anything else alongside the money, messages, contact, anything that crossed a line I'd define as more than friendly co-parenting. He said no, immediately and firmly, and I want to say clearly that I checked, once I had reason to check, going through what I could reasonably access of his phone and email with his knowledge over the following weeks as we worked through whether our marriage was going to survive this at all, and I didn't find evidence of anything physical or explicitly romantic in the way most people would define an affair. What I did find was 6 years of a specific kind of warmth in their texts that went beyond co-parenting logistics, inside jokes that had clearly outlived the marriage, references to memories only the two of them shared, a level of emotional check-in about Jenna's bad days and good days that felt more like an intact partnership than a professional co-parenting relationship. Messages where he'd ask how a hard week at her job had gone, where she'd tell him things about her own life that had nothing to do with the kids at all, where the tone read less like two people managing a shared custody schedule and more like two people who'd simply relocated their marriage into a lower gear without ever fully putting it in park. Nothing crossed into anything I could point to as explicitly romantic. All of it made obvious that Chris had never actually built the full emotional wall you'd expect between an ex-marriage and a current one, and that the money, in a strange way, had just been the most quantifiable piece of a much larger pattern I'd never had any reason to look for. I don't think what I found was a full affair. I want to be careful about that, because I know some people reading this are going to want a cleaner villain than what I actually have. What I think I found was a man who never fully closed the door on being needed by the family he used to have, and who solved that discomfort by quietly, expensively, secretly keeping one foot inside it for 6 years, at the cost of full honesty with both women who trusted him to be honest with them. We're separated now, not divorced yet, though I think that's likely where this ends. Chris moved into a rental about 10 minutes from our house 2 months ago, close enough for the custody schedule with Mia and Ben and for regular time with our daughter, which matters enormously to me regardless of what happens between us as a couple. We're doing this the careful way, with a family law attorney handling the financial side and a therapist we still see, individually now instead of together, mostly to help me process what 4 years of my marriage actually looked like once I understood the parts one hadn't been shown. The financial side of the separation has been its own strange education. Our attorney walked me through what 6 years of undisclosed transfers actually meant for how our marital assets would be characterized, and while Chris's income during our marriage was technically his own to direct, the fact that a portion of it had been redirected without my knowledge, in a way that materially affected decisions we'd made together, refinancing our own mortgage at a slightly less favorable rate at one point because our stated household savings looked thinner than they should have, delaying a kitchen renovation we'd talked about for 2 years because the numbers weren't quite there yet, gave me more leverage in the separation than I expected going in. I don't take much satisfaction in that leverage. I would have traded all of it for 6 years of just knowing the truth. I want to be honest that my extended family and even some of Chris's own family have not been unanimous in supporting my decision. Mia, who's 11 and old enough to sense that something in the house had shifted even before anyone explained it to her, asked me directly one evening, while I was helping her with a homework project, whether Chris and I were getting divorced because of her and Ben. I told her, as gently and honestly as I could manage without giving an 11-year-old more detail than she needed, that this had nothing to do with her or her brother, that her dad loved her completely and always would, and that the hard thing happening between the adults was about honesty, not about her. She sat with that for a minute, drawing on the corner of her worksheet, and then said, "Is it because of the house thing?" I heard Mom on the phone with her friend saying something about Dad paying for stuff secretly. I hadn't realized the kids had picked up on any of it, and it was a strange, sobering reminder that even the parts of this you try hardest to shield children from have a way of reaching them anyway, in fragments, through overheard phone calls and the changed temperature of a house. I told her that the money part was between the adults to sort out, and that what mattered most was that both her parents loved her, which was true regardless of anything else. My mother-in-law, Chris's mother, though I still genuinely like her, told me, gently but pointedly, over coffee about a month into the separation, that she thought I was punishing a good father for being a good father. She told me about Chris's own childhood, about his dad vanishing financially and emotionally after his parents' divorce when Chris was around Mia's age now, about how Chris had told her once, years ago, that he'd promised himself his own kids would never feel what he felt watching his father's involvement quietly evaporate. "I'm not saying what he did was right," she said. "I'm saying I understand exactly where it came from, and I wonder if you do too, or if you've decided it doesn't matter." "It matters," I told her. "It's part of why I'm as heartbroken about this as I am, honestly. I don't think Chris is a bad man. I think he's a man who solved a fear from his own childhood by building a structure of secrecy that ended up costing 2 other women their right to the truth about their own lives. Both things are real. I don't think there's a version of this where only one of them gets to count." She didn't have a response to that, and we sat with our coffee going cold for a while before changing the subject, the way families do when they've said the true thing and don't quite know what comes after it. I don't entirely disagree with the compassion in her argument, even now. I do think there's a difference between refusing to abandon your kids financially, which nobody in this story is arguing against, and secretly restructuring 6 years of your income and your emotional loyalty around a life you never fully left, while telling your current wife everything was merged and honest between you. The mortgage itself, in the end, wasn't really the thing that broke this. If Chris had told me on our third date that he was covering his ex-wife's mortgage to keep his kids stable and asked how I felt about that going forward, I think we could have built an honest version of our marriage around that fact, even if it meant harder conversations about money than most couples have to have. I've thought about that a lot in therapy, how much of my anger is actually about the money, and how much is about the 6 years of small, deliberate choices to keep me in the dark, and I keep landing in the same place. The money was never really the injury. The injury was learning that the man I thought I knew completely had been running a second, quieter version of his life alongside the one he showed me, for the entire time I'd known him, and that he was capable of doing that convincingly enough that I never once suspected it. My sister asked me, a few weeks into the separation, whether I thought I could have ever forgiven the money alone, without everything else that came with it. I told her I honestly didn't know, and that not knowing bothered me almost as much as anything else about this whole situation. The sense that I can't even cleanly identify where my own line was, because the money and the secrecy and the emotional entanglement all arrived at once, tangled together, and I've had to sort through them slowly instead of reacting to one clean betrayal. What broke it, in the end, was 6 years of him deciding, over and over, every single month, that I didn't get to know, that Jenna didn't get to know the full truth either, and that managing both of our understandings of reality was easier and safer for him than actually being honest with either of us about what he still needed from a marriage that had legally ended almost 8 years ago. Update, for the people who are going to ask, Chris has started making the mortgage payments transparently now. Through a modified informal arrangement Jenna and her attorney are actually formalizing into their custody agreement, since the kids' housing stability is something everyone involved still genuinely wants to protect, myself included. Jenna and Mark, from what I understand through the kids, are working through their own version of this reckoning, though that's obviously not my story to tell in detail. Chris and I are continuing individual therapy, and we've started a few joint co-parenting sessions specifically about our daughter, separate from whatever happens with the marriage itself, because regardless of where this ends, she deserves two parents who can be honest with each other about the parts of life that involve her. My daughter is too young to understand any of this yet, and my biggest hope, moving forward, whatever happens between Chris and me, is that by the time she's old enough to ask questions, both her parents will have actually learned something real from all of it, instead of just getting better at managing what everyone else is allowed to know. That's it for today's stories. If you want to see more of the best threads Reddit has to offer, make Reddit Be Mine a part of your daily routine. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a heartbeat. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next thread.